Welcome to episode 25 of the Seed Farmer Podcast. I'm Dan Brisebois, seed grower at Turnasol Cooperative Farm, spreadsheet and crop planning enthusiast, and author of The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seeds. With the Seed Farmer Podcast, I want you to get inspired to go out and grow some seed on your farm. I have some important news before we start this episode. So this is the last episode that I'll be putting out through the No-Till Growers Network. I'm going to keep releasing podcast episodes on my own, but you will only be able to find them through the Seed Farmer podcast feed on all your favorite podcast players. That means if you usually listen to the Seed Farmer podcast on the No-Till Growers feed, and you want to keep getting episodes into your podcast player, then you should go find the Seed Farmer podcast in your podcast player and subscribe to the podcast. That way, you won't miss any future episodes. So let's start the episode. Jared Zystro is this episode's guest. Jared is the Research and Education Director at the Organic Seed Alliance. Jared is based in Arcata, California. I invited Jared onto this episode so he can tell you about the Organic Seed Growers Conference in Corvallis, Oregon, that is taking place from February 26th to March 1st. I first went to this conference in 2008, and it was the single most important learning experience in my seed career. I also made so many great friends and contacts that have followed me throughout all my seedy endeavors. And I think that you would probably enjoy an experience like this also. So in this episode, Jared and I talk about what is happening at this year's conference and how you can participate not only in person, but also virtually if you can't make it to Corvallis. Jared and I talk about more than just the conference in this episode. We start with Jared's seed story and how it went from working summers on vegetable farms to ultimately getting a master's and PhD in plant breeding and plant genetics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we finish with a deep dive into growing quinoa for seed on both a larger commercial scale using a combine and a smaller scale with manual techniques. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Before we start the show, let's get a word from the Seed Farmer show sponsors.
Hello, everyone. This is Owen Taylor.
And this is Chris Bolden Newsom of True Love Seeds. We are farmers who run a seed company to preserve our ancestral plant relatives from all over the world and share our seeds with gardeners and farmers seeking out their beloved tastes of home.
We also have a podcast we think you will enjoy. It's called Seeds and Their People. We interview growers about the plants that keep their culture thriving.
Tune in wherever you listen to podcasts and at trueloveseeds.com.
All right, everyone, important public service announcement. I know some of you are already making plans for how you'll spend the winter, ordering tools, researching seeds, projecting crops. It's also a great time to gather with our farmers to share knowledge and skills. This February, join thousands of farmers like you from across the U.S. for 3 days of community building and farmer-led learning at the 36th Annual Marble Seed Organic Farming Conference in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Find out more and register at marbleseed.org/conference. All right, back to the show. Hi, Jared. Welcome to the Seed Farmer Podcast.
Hi, Dan. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure. I know I've invited you very last minute here, but the Organic Seed Conference is coming up in a month and a half or so, and I thought this would actually be, I think our listeners should know about it. And so that's one of the main reasons I want to bring you on. But then I also know that you are a seedy person beyond that. So I wanted to have a broader conversation too with you.
Great. Well, yeah, I really am honored to get to join this podcast. I really enjoyed getting to hear some of your other interviews, and it's been just really feel like the podcast that you have produced has just been a great way to get in touch a little bit more with what's going on in the seed world. So thanks for having me, and really excited to get to share a little bit.
I'm gonna just jump in, ask you, how did you start working with seed? Like, what's your seed story? When did you discover that seed was a thing?
It was somewhat accidental, I guess. I had been working on farms kind of throughout my early adulthood while I was going to school, and I wanted to, but it had always been sort of part-time, and I was looking for I remember it was a winter, and I was thinking about what I was going to do. I graduated college, and I was wanting to work on a farm, and it opened up this book. I think it was the Organic Volunteers listing, and it was kind of like Woof, but for longer term apprenticeships and internships. And I was just flipping through all the listings, and there was this farm. There was a listing there for this farm in New Mexico called Jardín del Alma, and they talked about growing. They're growing native plants and growing seed crops, and that was the first time I'd really ever heard of people growing seed as a crop, and it just seemed really fascinating. And the fact that they were doing both kind of native seeds and garden seeds, it really got me interested in it. And I packed up my bags and got on a Greyhound bus and just set foot on this beautiful farm in kind of central New Mexico. And that was the first time I'd ever really worked with seed in the sense of growing my own seeds. And it was an incredible experience in so many ways. The farmers, Joshua and Lynn, who ran the farm, were really conscientious and thoughtful about the work they were doing, and really inspiring about the value of seed. They put a lot of care into the crops that they cared for, and I had a chance to learn not just how to grow seed crops, but also really think about the history and stories of the seeds, think about how to do good selection and sort of the responsibility of caring for those seeds and those varieties to the next generation. I really, I caught the bug there, and it was a small farm, but we grew just, I think it was maybe around 50-ish different varieties each year, mix of things that we were supplying local farmers around the area, as well as on contract for Seeds of Change at that time, I think for Baker Creek as well, a few other contracts. And it really, I remember, and some people probably have heard this story, that I remember it really hit me when at the end of the season, the first season I was growing there, I had been helping to take care of, we'd had a Cherokee purple tomato seed crop. And I remember that we were supplying a local wholesale tomato grower with those seeds, and just this little plastic baggie full of several ounces of tomato seed, and just thinking about, like, I remember caring for those plants and selecting the best looking plants out of our plot to be saving seed from, and now that those seeds are going to just be representing an acre or more of tomato planting, and I hope I did a good job. I hope those plants all look as good as the care I had put into them. And it just made me realize just how impactful seed growing can be, the responsibility there, and the opportunity to really plug into this different part of the farming community that I hadn't known about before.
At that moment, when you were looking at that baggie full of seeds, did you know this is what you wanted to do with the rest of your farming life?
I felt really good about it. I don't think, I was 23 or something like that. I don't know if I knew what the rest of my life would look like, but I had thought a lot about what I wanted in life. And I wanted something that engaged, my heart and my hands, and my brain, and agriculture met a lot of those needs. And I saw with seed even more opportunities, especially as I started to get into the idea of kind of doing selection and improvement and like making crosses. And that really got me super excited. So at that moment, I don't think I realized I would be doing it, all these years later, but it definitely became a passion and something that I saw as, an important part of my path.
And then you went on to do a more academic approach also to seed. Am I right on that? You got more into the breeding work?
Yeah. So one of the things that during I spent a couple of years there in New Mexico, and really started to get into the breeding side of it while I was there, starting to just think about, like, okay, well, we're doing this selection and this stewardship of these varieties, but also we're starting to think about some crosses. And I realized, like, I had this copy of this old, it was like this first edition by the author was Allard. It was this, trying to think of the name of the book, if it's just called Plant Breeding.
I think it's called just Plant Breeding. I'm trying to look up. I think I have a later edition.
Yeah. There's a first and a second edition. The first edition is much better. The second edition is more esoteric. But and I was just reading through it, sort of trying to understand all of the nitty gritty of how, and I realized it's like, oh, there's a lot of technical information here, and I really would like to understand it. It felt a bit of this kind of mysterious science around like what breeding is, and I also have kind of a love for things like math, and it was really interesting sort of seeing the connection between math and agriculture that overlaps in plant breeding. And so I would just I lived in a tent at the time on the farm there, and I just read this Allard book in my tent at night, and kind of got to this point where I felt like, if I really want to understand this, I can continue to read these books on my own, and it's really interesting. But that I started to think maybe I want to go back to school for this. I kind of saw the idea of kind of like treating graduate school a bit like a vocational, voc tech, college. Like I'm going to, learn the techniques of plant breeding by just being immersed in a plant breeding program as a graduate student, like actually doing the ins and outs, like being surrounded by other people who are learning about plant breeding. So I'm reading these books, but also getting to like talk to people and do the work, in the context of, breeding projects with professors. And so decided that going to graduate school, even though I didn't see academics by any means as my future at that point, I was definitely pretty firmly on the path of wanting to have ultimately my own seed company and do my own seed growing. But I felt like plant breeding was going to be an important part of that, and I wanted to like get it down. And so talking to many people, they kind of were pointing me to graduate school. And so that's how I ended up at University of Wisconsin doing sweet corn breeding there and learning some of those great techniques around plant breeding.
Did you learn what you thought you were going to learn when you went to study in school? Like, and maybe part of the question I'm asking is I know there are some people who wind up working on a farm. Maybe they came from an academic background, they moved away from that, started working on a farm, and then they fall in love with breeding and that kind of potential, and they think maybe I should go back to school and study plant breeding. And so like part of my question is like, did you think you learned, or did you learn what you thought you were going to learn? Just for people who are thinking that, is this a good step for them?
I think so. Obviously, everyone's situation is going to be unique. I felt really fortunate in a lot of ways in that, at least at the time, and I'm not saying it's changed. It's just that I don't know. But at the time, I mean, University of Wisconsin had a really good kind of field-based, and in particular, Bill Tracy and the sweet corn breeding program had a really strong field-based breeding, meaning like you can go to graduate school for plant breeding and plant genetics and potentially never leave the lab and spend all your time, either on the computer or dealing with, molecular lab work and not necessarily go out to the field. That was not how it worked at University of Wisconsin with the sweet corn breeding program, at least. All of his students were out in the field in the summer. We are in the seed building in the winter, shelling and packeting and sorting. And Bill really also, my advisor, the sweet corn breeder at University of Wisconsin, was not just an academic. Like the breeding work that we did was not like, there was certainly science involved and like testing hypotheses and the kind of things you think about kind of academic science doing. But Bill spent a lot of time, like he organized this sweet corn processors group every summer, and they would all come together and like talk about what they needed from their sweet corn varieties. He held trials for all the other companies and he was really plugged into the seed growing, farming, processing communities, and very much like he had come from an industry background at one point and still maintained this approach of like, as a public plant breeding program, we need to be developing varieties to serve the public. And so the way that he approached things and the way we would learn as graduate students really was like that holistic, not just the academics, not just the science, but really like, how do you, from the start, like identify what are the needs of the communities that you're going to be breeding for, and how do you choose your parents? How do you make the crosses? How do you, grow the crop, harvest the seed, process the seed, like all the nuts and bolts pieces of actually doing good plant breeding. I learned in the program. And then also same thing, there was a lot of the classes that I took. I had the opportunity to like focus in on the things that I was really interested in. So like got to take like this plant disease resistance class where we really like talk through the nuts and bolts of like, how do you breed for disease resistance? So I felt like I got out a lot of what I wanted. I went in just to get a master's degree because I said, okay, I think I can take all the courses I need and can get in and out in 2 years, which is what I did initially. And I felt like I would recommend it to anyone who is sort of in that similar place where they really want the nitty gritty want kind of a 2-year plant breeding intensive training. But it does matter a lot who you work for as your advisor and where you end up going to school. Because like I said, I do know definitely people that didn't have those opportunities to really plug into the greater seed world or have a chance to really be out in the field a lot. And I think those things are really important and something I fortunately was able to get.
That sounds like a great opportunity. Maybe kind of going along, you ultimately have wound up working with the Organic Seed Alliance. Do you want to tell our listeners what the Organic Seed Alliance is?
Yeah, so the Organic Seed Alliance, we are a small but mighty organization that has staff in Washington and California and Wisconsin and Michigan currently, but we work throughout the country and beyond to ultimately put the power of seed back in the hands of growers. Growers are the original stewards and tenders of seed and are ultimately who do so much of the work to, develop, maintain, improve, produce, distribute the varieties that we all rely on. And so we really ultimately, our goal is to try and promote an abundant and diverse supply of organic seed tended in perpetuity by skilled, diverse, and interconnected communities of seed stewards. And so really centering the seed growers in our work. And our work consists of doing research. So the plant breeding I had been talking about, we have done a lot of work on trying to develop and not just new varieties for organic agriculture, but also models and systems for growers to be able to do their own variety improvement, and also doing research on improving seed production, making seed growing something that people can do as part of their livelihood, and putting out a lot of work on educational resources, publications, webinars, things like our Seed Growers Conference to connect seed growers together, to get them opportunities to sort of level up their seed growing skills and help them find opportunities to succeed. And then finally, the other piece besides research and education that we do a lot of work with is advocacy. So trying to promote policies that support farmers' rights to save seed, protect against things like GMO contamination, push back against kind of the concentration that we see in the global seed industry. So seeing kind of those three pillars of seed work in terms of research, education, advocacy, all with this focus on seed growers. So I've had the fortune of getting to work with OSA now for, about 15 years, and it's really been neat to see the seed community evolve over the years and get to be part of it in whatever ways I can be.
And what is your role nowadays at OSA?
So I'm now the director of research and education, and so kind of manage a lot of our research and education work right now. So things like our plant breeding, our seed production research, as well as some working on some of our educational pieces.
And are you in the field much nowadays, or are you more in the office?
I mean, this time of year, mostly in the office. I wrapped up all of the seed cleaning. Over the years, I've always found it valuable to maintain work in the field. I would like to, both for my own personal satisfaction, but also I think it's important to kind of keep my feet grounded and outside. And so, in the summer, realistically, it's probably about 2 days a week that I'm out in the field, though, is where it's at. So it has gone down over the years in terms of how much I'm out in the field.
When you're out in the field, are these OSA fields, or is it that you're working with partner farmers or maybe universities? Like, where are these fields?
It's really a mix. So a lot of our work has always been participatory, and with the goal of that the work is not just about, let's say, if we're doing a plant breeding project or some seed production research, it's not just about the end product of a variety, but it's also about the opportunities for collaboration and training that happen throughout that process, as well as the opportunities to kind of like share about that process at the end, about kind of using these as models. And so, as an example, last year I had some of the fields that I was managing basically myself that were leased from our local community college here. I live in Arcata, California, and as well as, for example, had a bunch of quinoa breeding projects with a local farmer. That's been largely, it's been this participatory project that a local quinoa grower here has been leading the sort of directing the goals of the breeding project. And I've just been there to kind of help with some of the techniques, as well as just like the handling of a whole bunch of, small plots of seed that are sometimes inconvenient to deal with on, a production farm. So it's a mix. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you questions about the quinoa later on when we get to the deep dive. I'm very curious. It's a crop I don't have as much experience with, or I have. Well, anyway, I got questions. So you said OSA does research, education, and advocacy, and I guess it's the education piece that I want to drill in on. And before I even talk about the conference, I would mention that in the past, when I was learning a lot about seed, one of the places that I found great resources was on the website. And you had a section, I think it's called publications, and just a number of short, like 2 to 10 page PDF documents on all kinds of topics, like crop specific, but also like weather. And I'm not sure about I don't remember all the topics, but there's a lot of information there. So I want the listeners to know that that's a tool they can go to of curated information that's written by like high quality seed people. And in addition, you also mentioned there's a lot of webinars and stuff that have been done, recordings over the years that are hosted, I think, on eOrganic. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's a mix. And thanks, Dan, for pointing to that. I would encourage anyone who's, I guess, wherever you are in your seed journey, there is a lot of material that we've developed over the years, as you alluded to, like on our publication list, a lot of crop-specific seed production guides and plant breeding guides, a lot of pieces around seed economics and how to make a livelihood, as well as pieces around kind of policy and the state of organic seed. We also, especially for people who are kind of getting started out in their seed growing, we have a asynchronous course. So a course that you can take at your own pace that is on our Organic Seed Commons platform. And that will kind of has a bunch of modules that you can take that walk you through a season of seed growing and all of the pieces that would be helpful to think through, with some really great people sharing their experience and expertise around things from, how do you do your crop, your initial crop and field planning, to how are you managing, population sizes and isolation distances and diseases. How do you, what are techniques around harvest and seed processing, as well as some specific topics on things like plant breeding and policy. So if you are kind of getting started in seed growing, there are a lot of great resources out there, including the Seed Farmer book that I'm so excited you released, Dan. But I would point, because it's not on our publications list, but you can find it through our website. Our seed on Organic Seed Commons, our seed growing course is a great place to kind of get things in a somewhat more organized fashion, where you can progress through the different modules, and it should hopefully get you some support for your, if this is your first or second season growing seed.
Let's take a quick break and hear from our show sponsors. The goal of the Culinary Breeding Network is to improve communication between plant breeders, seed growers, farmers, chefs, produce buyers, and others to improve quality in vegetables, fruits, and grains. The Culinary Breeding Network creates unique opportunities to taste in development cultivars where everyone can share opinions and be a participant in variety development. Inviting chefs, farmers, and everyday eaters into the breeding process increases public awareness and understanding of organic plant breeding. To learn more about the Culinary Breeding Network and find out about upcoming events, visit www.culinarybreedingnetwork.com and follow on Instagram. Are you a farmer looking for educational resources in Canada? Check out Young Agrarians. They are a farmer-to-farmer educational resource network for new and young ecological, organic, and regenerative farmers. Young Agrarians offers farmer-to-farmer programming, including tools and training around farming, business, mentorships, land access, and so much more. Interested in learning more? Head to youngagrarians.org and give Young Agrarians a follow on social media. All right, back to the show.
I'm so excited about that, because when I started, that didn't exist, and there wasn't that much information. And actually, this is maybe a pivot to one of the main things I want to talk about is, like, for me, the most important part of my early seed education was in 2008. I went to the Organic Seed Alliance conference in Salem, Oregon, and it blew my mind. Like I did, like, there was like a pre-conference track, and then there was like the 2 days and all the sessions. And I learned so much about like seed biology and seed production and seed economics. And I met so many people, so many of my seed heroes, and people that later on I would realize were really great growers. I made so many friends. And like the 2008 one, there wasn't another conference until 2012. And so there's like a 4-year break there. And I think it took me 4 years to unpack what I learned during that weekend. And it's the place I point anybody to who can make it. I know it can be tough to get there in person, though I guess we'll talk about how it's not the only option. So that's what I want. So I've already done a little bit of a pitch for it, but why do you think somebody should go out to the Organic Seed Growers Conference in Corvallis, Oregon this year?
Yeah. Great question, Dan. And I had a similar experience as you. I remember the first time I went to an Organic Seed Growers Conference. Actually, I was when I was in New Mexico, and I remember I was so excited. I had this tetberry bean trial I had done myself with all these seeds I'd gotten from the USDA Germplasm Center, and done this whole trial to look at yields, and made this back in the day when you would make posters with just foam board, and made this poster to bring to the conference, and just likewise was blown away when I arrived by the in-depth information, by the connections that could be made. And I feel I hear that same story from so many others. The Seed Growers Conference, it's the largest organic seed specific conference, and generally has happened every other year, though there have been some breaks there, including now. I think this will be we did a virtual conference, but this will be 5 years since we had our last in-person one. So this is going to be a reunion of sorts, I think, for lots of us. And if you can make it there, I think this year's is going to be really special in a lot of ways. It's in case anyone's listening, they are wanting to put this on their calendar. It's happening from this February 26th through March 1st up in Corvallis, Oregon. And it has a theme around weaving visions of organic seed communities. So really focusing on the idea of strengthening those connections that sustain the seed movement. So much of this conference, like you said, there's a lot of really great in-depth content across many different tracks, from beginning seed growing to advanced seed growing to plant breeding and seed advocacy and seed stories. But in addition to that, I think it's really important to highlight that those opportunities for connections really are something special. This is a special community of seed growers around the country and around North America and around the world. And this is a place where many folks can gather. And those connections that you can build at a conference like this will be something that you're going to carry with you for many years, maybe for the rest of your life. So we have, I think, over 90 speakers this time around. So just a ton of different perspectives from all over the country, from the Northeast and the Southeast and the middle of the country and the Southwest. So you can kind of get a sense of how people are growing seed in lots of different regions and climates, at different scales and with different goals. So we've got a great keynote this time around. We have Vivian Sansour of the Palestinian Heirloom Seed Library, who's going to be doing our keynote. And we're going to have the sessions posted really soon, but there's a lot of them that I'm excited for, including some of the ones I know you're going to be participating in, Dan. In addition to the main conference sessions, we have a pre-conference events, including our farm tour, which usually, unfortunately, fills up quick. So if you're considering or on the fence about doing, you want to do it now. Otherwise, the buses will be full. There's limited space. The farms can only accommodate so many people, so they always tend to sell out early. But those will be an opportunity to tour several different seed farms in the Willamette Valley, see how they're doing things, how their operations are working. And then in addition to that, we'll have a seed intellectual property pre-conference intensive. And then this year we'll be doing for Spanish-speaking participants, a pre-conference seed growing intensive that's going to be in Spanish. But I would also say one of the cool things about the conference, in addition to all the sort of tracks, that all the formal sessions, the pre-conference events, the keynote, which is all really exciting, like, it's so much more than just that. We have it's really is a community built event in so many ways, beyond just like the robust planning committee that put together so much of this agenda. The conference is going to be built by the community that's there. We have something called Synergy Spaces, where anyone can sign up for a space to talk about propose a deep dive on a specific topic, whether it's quinoa seed growing, or seed policy in the EU, or being able to how do you make a living as a first time, how do you manage your contracts as a first time seed grower. There have been many different sort of synergy tracks over the years, and those are things that really just bubble up by the conference participants. So
I would actually say the synergy spaces have been some of my favorite spaces when I've been in person at the event. I know that I've been in one where we're talking about cut flowers or seeds for cut flowers. Often there's one about like small seed companies, and they're like, so the sessions are great, but I find the synergy space permits really an involvement that you wouldn't expect, and people are just so friendly and open, and there really is place to exchange. So I've been really impressed by those, and I know that a number of them have spun out into listservs where the conversations have been continuing in some cases for like 5 or 6 years since then. And some of the work that there's some contract growing work that's been doing, I think it began in one of the synergy spaces. So those are if you're at the event in person, go to them.
Yeah. I think, Dan, what you alluded to there, and something for anyone who hasn't spent as much time kind of with the organic seed community, one of the things I've really noticed, and certainly I feel like I hear this a lot from people who are coming maybe from other realms of agriculture or business is that the organic seed growing community is, in general, really open, giving, generous with information and supporting each other. And you really see that at the conference and places like those synergy spaces where people like, they just, oftentimes people just like they just open their books and share everything. Like, how can we help you succeed as a seed grower or starting your own seed company? And so it's really, we're really lucky to be part of such a great community, and the conference, we're really lucky to be able to support just a space, a holding space for all of these brilliant, generous people to come together to share and connect and inspire each other. Like you said, there are many activities, events, listservs that have spun out from the conference.
If the listeners can make it in person, it's really a fantastic thing. But I recognize that, there's the cost of flying, there's the cost of lodging, the cost of the event itself. Though I think there are some scholarships. And then there's just it's hard to get away sometimes from home. Now, but there is a virtual component also. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. You're exactly right. One of the things that is always a challenge is, the conference is in just a single physical location, and it can be hard to travel for cost reasons, for just being able to take time away from your work, your family, and there are a few things that we've really thought hard about and recognize how those limitations exist, and what can we do to break down those barriers so that we can get more people to get to engage and benefit from the conference. And some of those places include, as you had mentioned, trying to offer more scholarships, reduced ticket prices, even some travel scholarships. Also thinking towards the future of, though it's a big lift for our small staff, considering like moving the conference to other locations so it can be more easy to access. But this year, one of the things we are doing is we're offering the conference as a hybrid event, which means that although it's not fully hybrid, we're not able to offer all of the sessions and all of the tracks virtually. A significant chunk of the sessions, two of the tracks. So I think that's a total of 12 sessions. I'd have to look at the agenda to see for sure, but are going to be offered. I
think you're right about that.
Virtual sessions, so that you can attend them live. Can be able to ask questions during the Q&A. And can do that from the comfort of your own home, wherever you might be living in the world. So even if you're not able to physically come out to the conference, this is still a chance. We're really trying to build out those virtual offerings to make it one of the things. So in 2022, in kind of still in the midst of with everything going on with COVID, we offered our conference as entirely virtual. There's a lot that was being missed by not having it in person. We heard loud and clear from people all around the world when we offered the conference virtually how grateful everyone was to, we heard from a lot of people, this is the first time I've been able to participate in the conference, and please continue to make, this virtually available. And so we wanted to try and honor that and make sure that people who had been attending our virtual conference in 2022 from all over the country, all over the world, can continue to engage. So yeah, if you're able to come, certainly encourage it. It's a great experience. If you're not able to come in person, check out the virtual conference. You can find out more of the details about all of this, seedalliance.org/conference. That's also where you can register for either the in-person or the virtual.
Fantastic. So let us switch from talking conference to talking seed shop. So I'm excited to talk to you about quinoa, and tell us about quinoa as a seed crop.
So I kind of stumbled into this in that there is, like I mentioned, I live on the Arcata, California, which is climate-wise on the far north coast of California. So a very temperate climate, kind of all year round, when the rest of the country is like, if you look at a map of the country, it's like all red in the summer and all blue in the winter. Like our little sliver is always green. It's always like 45 to like 75, like regardless of the time of year. It's probably about 55 out right now, Fahrenheit. And quinoa, it seems to do quite well here. And there's been some discussion of if it's just strictly a temperature thing. Many people believe that quinoa is really heat sensitive. It's also, I've heard also that it may be related to lygus bug that in most parts of the country, lygus is a really big issue for quinoa seed, but that where we live, in part because of our climate, we might not be getting that kind of pressure. All that to say, in our little corner, there has been a niche of production for quinoa for food organically. So some of for a while there, one of the local farmers here was the largest quinoa grower in the country, and we live in a place that doesn't have a lot of prime agricultural ground. So it's kind of emblematic of how this climate is really seems to be good for growing quinoa. And so I stumbled on this because one of our local farmers here, he was growing quinoa and had been growing a variety he'd been saving himself that was this really diverse population that he had gotten in turn from White Mountain Farms in Colorado. But and it was a mix, like it was, the seeds were white and black and red and brown and kind of all the spectrum in there. And he was really looking for a large white seeded variety, but that one that would grow well in his production system, which was a really heavy, densely planted system. So for quinoa is I would say a very plastic crop in the sense of it can adapt to a lot of different growing systems. And I know, for example, back when I was first learning about growing quinoa, a lot of growers were transplanting out. They were starting their quinoa as starts and then transplanting them out, often at kind of like 1 foot in row spacing between plants. And the quinoa plants would end up filling up that space. They would put out some side branches. They would all those would develop their own little panicles, and it would fill up the space. However, Blake, the farmer I was working with, realized that the problem with that was twofold. The problem with having really wide space transplanted out quinoa was, first off, it meant that while those plants were kind of filling out the space, completing the canopy, there was a lot of time there for weeds to see that sunlight and sprout and begin to develop, and it took a lot of extra cultivating. And also, when you have these really big plants, what you tend to have is you have a range of physiological development of those panicles. So the kind of the main and kind of central panicle might be close to fully mature, whereas some of the side ones are still maturing. Whereas what Blake learned is he started planting. He'd do 16-inch rows with, and he would drill it in somewhere around. So instead of one plant per foot, he was drilling maybe around somewhere around 10 seeds per inch, just thick. And what would happen was all of those plants, they would kind of compete with each other, and they would sort of push each other out and close the canopy in between the rows, like within 4 to 6 weeks of planting, just really quickly. And they would outcompete the weeds, because there were just the abundance of quinoa plants. Now, if there was a mustard, seed in there, it would have to be competing with hundreds of quinoa plants around it. And finally, what it meant was that with all that competition, each individual quinoa plant might just have one little panicle, but they were all about the same height, and they would all mature about the same time, and they tended to mature a little earlier. And what Blake found was that the yields would be just as good. He would just get the yields earlier, and he'd be able to drive his combine a little bit higher because all the plants were a bit higher and same height. So it was a system that worked really well for him, but he wanted varieties that could thrive in that system while meeting these market needs of large white quinoa. So all that being said, that was kind of how I first got introduced to quinoa growing, and it's a in a lot of ways it is a pretty straightforward crop because, well, it's a small seed. So the other quirk and just the realization of like how I've grown it, which is not going to be the case for everyone. We live in a unique climate in a lot of ways, and one of the things that's really relatively common here is the practice of dry farming, meaning just growing with the residual seasonal rains. We live in a Mediterranean climate where we get a bunch of rain in the winter and then pretty much no rain through the summer growing season. And so with Blake, he often was growing on clay soils that would be able to retain the moisture fairly well. And so just it'd plant heavily, plant shallow, but basically right as the soil was starting to dry out in the spring, and the quinoa would just have to, the plants would just chase that moisture down as it was drying throughout the summer. The roots would chase the moisture down, which was also helpful for weed control.
So yourself, when you're working with quinoa, are you also combining or are you harvesting by hand?
Yeah. So when we're doing our breeding work, usually how it's worked is I'll be in charge of doing dealing with, maybe we have like 100 10-foot plots in the middle of a 10-acre seed, or production field. One of the things to realize is, quinoa has a range of outcrossing. It really depends. It's variety dependent, individual dependent to some extent with these diverse varieties. And so some people say, well, quinoa is just entirely self-pollinating. You can plant it really close. No, it will often cross. It depends on the variety. Those ranges have not been really established in terms of what varieties and how far they cross. But in the breeding work, at least in the early breeding, we would just grow the plots close together. I would be hand planting and hand harvesting. So typically when I'm hand harvesting, it's fairly straightforward. I'm either just like cutting with like one of the little, short handles kind of sickles, or just with just some pruners. If I'm dealing with, just 100 plots, I'm putting those in mesh or paper bags, bringing them in to finish drying and then hand processing.
I like hearing that you have to bring them into finished drying, even though you're in a dry climate, because we can't dry them in the field. Like if we leave, like we have a humid summer. And so if we leave quinoa longer than a certain point, the planting will rot down on us. And so at what point what is a visual indicator to you that you could harvest something and bring it indoors to keep drying?
Yeah, I think for me with quinoa, once you start to see, the plant itself beginning to dry down. So if you're seeing, you can often see quinoa's got like some fun kind of color change indicators on the plant, right? You'll see, they're starting out, it depends. There's different colors to quinoa. It's a really beautiful crop in a lot of ways, but typically, you're seeing something that's greenish or maybe has some purplish to the plant, but then as it dries down, some of those, anthocyanins and things like that might become more bright for a little while, and then everything's going to kind of turn a little bit more tannish, brownish, and that's usually what I'm looking at. I'll try and leave it in the field for as long as possible. So the final, proof usually, it's like so many dry seeded crops, I would say, is, looking at the seeds themselves. So, if you take a seed, even if they're not necessarily at the point where the panicle is dry enough to just, free thresh, if you take an individual seed, like it has the seed made that transition from being, squishy to, has the seed hardened. each individual seed. Once the individual seeds have hardened, that's usually a pretty good sign that you're about at physiological maturity, even if things haven't dried down. And so, yeah, for us, we do have a dry summer, but we do tend to get some rains in September, and certainly by October, rains. So a lot of times it's more like we'll leave them in the field as long as we can. But if we're seeing rains coming and they're extended, this is a naked seeded crop. There's no pod, no capsule, no fleshy fruit that's really protecting it very well. And so they will be susceptible to kind of pre-harvest sprouting if you get any extended moisture on them. They can handle if you get a little, whether it's morning dew or even just like a relatively brief rain, if there's a chance for it to kind of dry out again. But if you're looking at a couple of days of rain and they're at that point where they've started to dry down, then yeah, we'll just go ahead and bring them in and finish drying.
Once they're dried down and they've after ripened, how do you extract the seed and clean it?
Yeah, I mean, they're really pretty easy crop, I would say, in general to process. Again, like I said, at a large scale, like the production scale, we're dealing with, Blake's going to combine, and then he's running that initially through his air screen cleaner, and then through his gravity table. That's kind of at the large scale. At the small kind of breeding plot scale, then typically pretty easy crop. I'll either just go ahead and just hand thresh them. So, if depending on the size of the plot, I'll just go ahead and, thresh them with my feet, or push them through, hardware cloth or a screen to do the initial threshing. And then, I often find what happens with quinoa is one of the challenges is that will get you seed that still has a lot of the bracts attached to it. And so trying to break those bracts free of the quinoa, usually easiest way is some way to get the seed to rub against itself. So like sometimes if it's a small plot, I might just, be taking my hands and just giving it kind of a rub. If it's a larger thing, using a strategy that we used to do for kind of carrot seed deburring, which is like putting it in like a 5-gallon bucket and then putting like a paint mixer or something like that in there to just get everything agitating against itself. So all those seeds are rubbing, so you can kind of rub those bracts off. Once you've got those bracts broken off of the seed, then, just a basic fan winnowing can pretty well take care of the job.
And I guess it's not really necessary from a seed production perspective, but if somebody was going to eat this, how do you deal with the saponins? If you do that, do you have any secrets or tricks?
Yeah, so saponins, you're right. So one of the things with quinoa is that it has a lot of saponins. So these are soapy particles. There are some varieties out there that are like some breeders in France have developed that are saponin free or really, really low saponin. Although the minus of those is the saponins also keep the birds from eating the seed. So we've noticed that like we get a lot more bird predation on the low saponin varieties. So that's a trade-off. Most varieties do have a lot of saponin in them. Again, at a commercial scale, Blake, the farmer I work with, he actually imported a rice polisher that can be used for polishing off that outer layer with the saponins in it. But for people at home, if you're growing your own quinoa, generally the process that works-ish is,
I love that hesitation.
What you would do is you would put as much of a batch as you're going to be eating, within a couple of weeks. You can put that in a pillowcase and put it in the washing machine and go ahead and run it through, just a cold wash cycle for potentially a few rounds, and then spread it out and dry it down. And then, that seed, you're going to want to, prioritize eating those first. But that's a way to do it. It just, traditionally people maybe would, put it in a running stream, just like you're, harvesting acorns, try and get the tannins out. But a washing machine can work pretty well if you don't have some kind of polishing machine.
Or a running stream close at hand.
Right.
All right. So let's get to the wrap-up questions. So, Jared, what would you tell your younger seed growing self?
I think I would one of the things that it took me a little while to realize is what I had mentioned earlier is the generosity of the seed growing community. I would tell my younger self to not be afraid to, of course, being polite and unaware of people's time, but not be afraid to reach out to seed growers, and ask for advice, make connections. There's so much experience that is not written down, that the more of it is on this podcast now, but there's a lot that's out there that really comes from connecting with other seed growers. If I had a chance, I would maybe tell myself to work on more seed farms to see the range of perspectives and scales. I had a chance to sort of work on a really small farm. I worked with Nash up in Washington at kind of a larger scale of seed growing. But I think I would encourage myself to do a bit more of a tour, work on some more farms, see the different ways that people are approaching seed growing, and really feel comfortable in making the attempt to just reach out and ask questions, because in my experience, people have always been so generous with their knowledge, and you gain so much from that.
I echo what you say. So what would you say to market growers, be the vegetable growers, the herb growers, or flower growers, to inspire them to grow some of their own seed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I would say, even if you're not necessarily considering seed growing as an enterprise, as something that you're going to be directly selling and making money from, there are so many benefits in developing and maintaining your own varieties as a market grower. I think one of the people I always kind of put in front of the mic around this question, there's a couple of local farmers in the area in my area that I work with, Jacques and Amy Newcomb, and they really have a good description of they have varieties at the farmers market, some of their melons, their cipollini onions, some of their tomatoes that are ones that they have basically been doing selection and seed saving on for years and years and years now. And even though they're not selling the seed of them, what it's given them is varieties that no one else has, that have some really unique and appealing attributes. Like their cipollini onions are they're all single core, and they're all the other growers are just getting their seed from the usual places where they've got kind of these multi-core cipollinis, and ours are these single core that people come back for because they love them. And so it's an opportunity for you to have your own unique varieties that are adapted to your climate, right? Because a lot of seeds are being selected and produced somewhere else in the country. So they're if you do your own seed saving and selection, you can adapt those varieties to your climate, to your production conditions, like I was talking about with Blake, and needing varieties that can do well in his really dense planting schemes, and also to your markets. So like Jacques and Amy, with being able to have varieties that they understand these are things that are going to really pop at the farmers market and are unique, and will be kind of calling cards that people come back to their stand because they're the only people that have them, because they save their own seed.
And is there something that I should have asked you that I did not ask you?
Maybe I'll say I want to make a pitch, if that's all right.
Go for it.
Yeah, for another project that we're working on, because I know there's hopefully a lot of seed growers that are listening to this podcast, that we are starting a new project, recognizing there's a lot of mystery and uncertainty around seed yields. How much do different varieties actually end up yielding, and how much, what do you need to charge to get a fair price to be economically viable, is so tied in with seed yields. We're doing a new project where we are working with growers all around the country to conduct organic vegetable seed yield trials. If you're interested, we're launching it now, and you can check out our website. There's information. The project is called Osprey, Organic Seed Production Research on Economics and Yield. And sign up now for this growing season. There are stipends available for you to track seed yields on existing crops that you're growing, or to grow some of the crops that will be common across all growers all around the country.
And so you kind of maybe have just answered that, but how can people find out more about what you and OSA are doing?
Yeah, so if you're curious to kind of keep up with some of the work that we're doing, as well as hear about some of the other folks in the organic seed community, I would encourage you to check out some of our social media channels like Instagram or Facebook, Twitter, as well as you can sign up for our newsletter. If you come to our website, which, as Dan alluded to, has a ton of great resources, it also will, we put out regular kind of updates on the projects that are going on. So if you could come to our website, you can see those. You can also sign up for the newsletter, check out our social media, or join us on, again, what I alluded to, this Organic Seed Commons, which is sort of a social network just for organic people who are involved in organic seed.
And we did not get a chance to get into this because we can't talk about everything. But I did also want to mention that you are one of the authors of the book, The Seed Garden, which is a phenomenal resource that covers, I can't remember, like 30 or 40 different crops, and has great pictures and a lot of information. So that's something also that I just want to point out while we're here.
Yeah, I would encourage people to take a look. There's a lot of great books out there, like your book, The Seed Farmer, The Seed Garden, John Navasio's Organic Seed Farmer. There's, when I was starting out in all of this, there were not nearly as many resources. Of course, the classic seed to seed, but now there are a lot more resources out there for beginning seed growers. And I'm happy that I had a chance to contribute in a small way to getting some more of that information out there.
Well, so am I. So Jared, thank you so much for being on this podcast and sharing with us. And I hope you see all of our listeners in person or virtually at the Seed Growers Conference.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, come join us February 26th through March 1st, Corvallis, Oregon.
Fantastic.
And that's episode 25 of the Seed Farmer Podcast. A huge thanks to Jared for being on the podcast, and I hope to see all of you at the Organic Seed Growers Conference, either virtually or in person. Now, here are a few of my own personal seed updates. At Turnasol, I've just updated our online store with new varieties for 2025. Actually, I still have to add 3 brand new poppies that we bred on farm. They're really beautiful, but we need to choose names for them before we post them. And it's amazing how difficult that step is. I'm also heading to the Guelph Organic Conference at the end of this week. If you're there, come and say hi. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, this is the last episode that I'll be putting out through the No-Till Growers Network. If you usually listen to the Seed Farmer Podcast on the No-Till Growers feed and you want to keep getting episodes, you have to go and find the Seed Farmer Podcast in your podcast player and subscribe to the podcast. Now, I'm really appreciative for having been part of the No-Till Growers Network. This podcast would not have happened without Jackson Roulette and Jesse Frost. I've been listening to podcasts and audiobooks for at least 15 years, and I had long entertained the idea of starting a seed podcast, but I'm not sure that I would have taken the action to do this on my own. When Jackson and Jesse invited me to host the show, they helped set me up with the equipment I needed. They took on post-production and publishing the episodes. They also coached me through many tricks and tips as I got my first episodes recorded. Working with no-till growers let me focus on finding guests and having seedy conversations without worrying about the rest of the process. 25 episodes later, I know a lot more than when I started. This seed of a podcast has sprouted and put out some true leaves, and I feel confident that it can photosynthesize and grow into a big podcast plant of its own. Thank you, Jackson and Jesse, for helping me get started. I am immensely grateful. And thank you to the rest of the folks at No-Till Growers who have made this podcast happen. Michael, who has edited these last 15 episodes, and Michelle, who is taking care of finding sponsors. Thank you so much. And a huge thanks to Sophia Sedelton for the theme music. You can hear more of their music at sophiasedelton.com. And thank you so much for joining me in these conversations with the seed farmers. You can find more seed growing resources on my blog at seedgrowers.farm. While you're there, you can subscribe to my newsletter full of seed growing, crop planning, and farm spreadsheets. You can also order a copy of my book, The Seed Farmer, A Complete Guide to Growing, Using, and Selling Your Own Seed. The Seed Farmer podcast is produced in part by no-till growers with the help of our sponsors. If you haven't already subscribed to this podcast, now's the time. You wouldn't want to miss the next episode. Until then, happy farming.